Other sources of variance and domain configuration and introduction. Now we have already discussed the reasons for the variance of language use across individuals and across groups. Now we would like to identify what are the other sources of variation within language use. That is, why do people or why do certain groups choose one language over the other given a situation or a context? And this takes us into the domain configuration issues. Now, before we start our discussion in the coming modules, we need to understand that this is definitely a very complex issue. It has several levels of complexity, but first of all, one needs to question what is the perspective or what is the stance that we want to take up when we want to study this issue. Do we take up the linguist stance, that is, look at language variation in terms of phonemes, in terms of lexical items, in terms of grammatical interference, and see how the two languages or the three languages a person might know interfere with each other, and how does a person actually borrow one thing from the other, and what are the reasons behind it. So we look at the structure of the language only and try to identify the sources of language variation. And then if we are doing it, the question is, do we ignore the interference or do we ignore the variation at semantic level? So at semantic level would mean that even when a person is using one language, that person might actually be transferring a similar meaning from his first language into the second language. And when it gets configured into the second language, that meaning gets distorted. So are we looking at the semantics also, or do we restrict ourselves only to the superficial language structures? That is one question that anyone doing research on multilingualism has to identify or decide. Or there is another perspective. For instance, we look at it from the perspective of a psychologist, and we see that how quickly or how automatically a person is able to translate from one language to the other, and what is the speed of that translation, and what is the speed of the response that a person is able to give if somebody asks a question in the first language or in the second language. Are we interested in the processing of information, and do we compare that kind of variation across multilinguals or across languages? Is this what we want? Or would we like to take up an educator's interest and we try to find out that what is the relative global general proficiency in a language? Do we want to test language proficiency itself? So depending on what we decide, we need to keep in mind that all of these are legitimate concerns. So it is not that if I choose an educator's perspective, I am saying that other perspectives are wrong. But what we are saying is that coming from my own background or coming from your own background, you might be interested in either one of them. It is important to identify the difference in stance from the very beginning, because the stance that you use will change the kind of research you will do. It will also affect the findings. Now, somehow, the discussion that we are doing right now and will be doing in the coming modules is somehow biased towards This sociologist's concern for language maintenance and language shift. So we are more interested now, as to put everything in perspective, we are more interested in looking at how frequently individuals or certain groups use language A or language B, and at what points would they like to use language A or language B, and when do they code switch. And this takes us into the questions of domain configuration and domain analysis challenges, and we will discuss this in the coming modules.